Once again, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Happy to see you all here. I don't know how long my voice is going to hold up this morning. I was kind of really surprised that it is as rough as it is this morning. And one of some of the things that we need to talk about is I'm going to bring out a message today concerning the idea of leadership within the church. And as you consider the idea of leadership within the church, I'm not talking about elders and deacons, although that is normally who we think about as leaders in the church. I believe that every Christian has a work to do. While I'm going to be dealing with the idea of the elders and deacons and so forth, I think that there's things that we all need to do. And that is going to be the import of my sermon. Of what can I do as an average Christian in order for the church to grow and to go forward. I think of this one story that I've heard almost ever since I went to Bible college. I don't know if it's a true story, or if it actually happened, or if it's a product of the imagination of some energetic preacher who was trying to drive home a point. But it seemed like this particular congregation had its elders and deacons and trustees and so forth, that they had their regular monthly meetings in order to be able to discuss the business of the church. And they had a man on the church board in his particular office, I'm not sure of, who could have the name Mr. Contrary. For he was a type of person that no matter what was said, he always took the opposite position. If somebody said, boy, this is a hot day, Mr. Contrary would try to tell you how cold it was. Everything that the church board would ever bring up to be able to do as far as planning was concerned, Mr. Contrary was against it. And as a result, nothing ever got done as far as the planning and program and the witness of that particular congregation. It turned out that one of the board meetings one month was called, and Mr. Contrary was not there. So they started their board meeting, discussing the business of the church, and they made their plans, and everything was approved almost unanimously because of the fact that Mr. Contrary was not there. And the meeting went smooth, and there was harmony, there was planning, there was great spirit within the church board meeting. And it came down where they were winding things down and coming to the end of the board meeting. And one of the elders spoke up and talked about us, and now Mr. Contrary says, I like the guy, but he's always against everything. We never get anything done. And they all agreed. So the point was made that maybe if they prayed for Mr. Contrary in a positive way, an encouraging way, that maybe he would change his attitude and become more cooperative as far as planning the program of the church was concerned. So they all decided that what they were going to do, that they were going to bow their heads. And everyone will do themselves want to have a simple moment of silent prayer. And this particular elder that raised a question for us for praying for Mr. Contrary would end the board meeting with prayer. And just as they were about to begin their prayer, the door busted open. Mr. Contrary marched in, shouting to the top of his voice, I don't care what you're planning or whatever it is, I'm against it. That story would be funny to me if it were not so true. I have been in board meetings that have been almost as bad as what is described as far as this is concerned. I have been in board meetings which ended up in a fist fight almost. I have been in board meetings where I've seen people not in speaking terms with other members of the church. And you all know me, I have talked about Corbin, Kentucky several times. Good old church, I appreciate the church there. But right outside of town, there was another church. And that other church had a history of being like the church board meetings that you find here in this little story that I told. I talked to one man who had been an elder in that particular church for years. He was one of the instrumental people that went and started a church in London, Kentucky. And I talked to him. And I told him one time, I said, why did you change churches? Why did you come up here? And we were talking just about establishing churches in that area. He says, Phil, I'm going to be honest with you. He said, when one of the elders struck me with his fist as hard as he could, I thought it was time for me to leave the church. And then he told me about a situation that happened. They were talking about either paving or concreting the parking lot. This elder that struck the other one with his fist, wanted it asphalt. Wanted it asphalt. Everybody else wanted a concrete. Now the only reason why this man wanted asphalt because his son-in-law had just started an asphalt business. And the price was far greater than if it were to be concrete. So the church had already made the plans, already advertised, already announced the fact that they were going to concrete. Came the night of the church board meeting, which that was to be made a permanent thing to finalize the program. This elder that wanted an asphalt reached in his pocket and pulled out a gun. And laid it on the table and said, I'm going to have my way or else. I've seen board meetings of all kinds. I have served churches that the board meeting was a farce. I have served churches where they had no idea of having a board meeting. And the church leadership leaves far to be desired. When I look at today's church and see some of the things that are being done, I think the number one miracle of our day is that church still exists. And I'm sorry for making that statement. I'm sorry that I had to. I think there is enough potential in the churches today that if we were to forget who we are and remember what we are, that we can change the world in which we live. Now, I want to make some things clear before I go on. Number one, I'm not isolating the Holland Church of Christ. And I don't want you to even begin to think that what I'm saying this morning is typical of what I find here in Holland. I love the leadership here. I think you have some of the finest leadership for a small church that you can find anywhere. And I appreciate them. And I've told people how much I appreciate them. I see people that have dedicated themselves to keeping this church going, even to their own detriment. And I appreciate that. So I am not really using my sermon as a chastisement for the leadership of Highline Church of Christ. My point is to be able to encourage you to do more and get more people involved in these particular things. I am putting every Christian into the point of leadership. And as I preach my sermon, or as I go through the things that I want to go through, I want you to keep asking yourself, what can I do as a Christian? Not as a forefront leader, but what can I do in order for the advancement of the kingdom? And one of the things we need to remember is my point number 3 in the list I have there. And I want you to think about what I'm saying right now because it's important. The church is not a democracy to be run by the members of an organization. The church is a theocracy with God as the ruler and the creator, Jesus Christ as king, and we are subject to God, and we have no say in the matter because if God says it, that settles it. And we have no responsibility except to do what God wants us to do. I look at this thought about church not being a democracy. And as I think about that church not being a democracy, how many things have crept into the church only because of the vote of the congregation? Even though the vote was wrong. And the last thing I want to be clear, God has, while He used leaders within the church, but He used other people as well to accomplish His purpose. Both in the Old and New Testament, there are people that are unnamed, people who just appear for a little while in the shadow of history or the line of history that God has used. And we don't hear about them anymore. Just for a moment, how many disciples were there? How many apostles were there? If we go to the original, there were 12. Judas Iscariot was taken away, and Matthias was put in his place. If you go through the Bible, the New Testament, there were 17 different individuals that were named as apostles. You hear quite a bit about Peter, James, and John, and Paul. You hear about Matthew because he wrote one of the Gospels. You hear about some of the other ones simply because they appeared on the scene for a little while. But what do you hear about Bartholomew? What do you hear about the other James, James the Less? What about the other Simon? And what about Thomas, other than 3 times that you hear about him and they doubting Thomas, which I disagree with? God used them. Tradition tells us what they did, and they did some mighty fine work. And God used him in a quiet way for the advancement of his kingdom. Just for a moment, I'm going to scan as quickly as I can some of the ones I have here. I'm going to go to the Old Testament as well as the New this morning and talk about different things. But I want you to think about Esther. Oh, good old Esther, the part of the Medes of the Persian Empire. She was very much responsible for the favoritism of the Persian Empire to the Jewish people and allowed them to go home and to rebuild the temple wall and so forth, and to reestablish their country. Little girl, taking part in a beauty contest, won the contest to become queen. Mordecai, her uncle, stayed in the background. The king made a decision that would cause the death of many, many Jewish people. And Mordecai wants to know, you go and talk to the king about it. And Mordecai told her that she didn't do it. I think if I were in Esther's shoes, that my knees would have been knocking as I went into to go see the king. Because if she went in and found his displeasure, she could be put to death. She could be put to death. Listen to what Mordecai told her. You have your pamphlets, you might want to read. Then Mordecai commended to answer Esther. Think not for yourself that thou shalt escape in the king's house, more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. In other words, Mordecai said, God's going to help him. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knows whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this. I want you to think just for a moment. I believe we're living in exciting times as far as the church is concerned. I'm sorry that my age is getting to the point where I cannot do what I want to do. But I think the future of the church can be glorious if we get back to doing what we need to be doing. And maybe God called you into his kingdom. And I'm not talking about predestination or anything of this sort. I'm just talking about in general. Maybe God called you into his kingdom in order for you to be that person, to lead this congregation to glory. Who knows? God knows. Then Mordecai said to Esther, who knows that God may have called you into the kingdom for such a time as this? And I like what Esther responded. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. And if I die, if I perish, I'll perish. Think about that. Way back in 2 Kings, the 5th chapter, there was a little slave girl captured by the Assyrians. And because Naaman was a good man, high up in the national protection of the Assyrian government, he had a slave girl. And she was given over to Naaman's wife. And Naaman was a leper. He was willing to be able to spend all the money in the world to be able to get himself cured of leprosy. And find this little Jewish girl. We have a prophet in our country, back home, that if you go and ask, he can cure your leprosy. So Naaman went. He was told by by the prophet of God to dip himself in the river Jordan 7 times, 7 ducks in the muddy river. And when he came up, his skin was white as snow. His leprosy was cured. Only because one young slave girl told about that problem. Interesting. In the New Testament, there is one of the miracles of Jesus Christ that is mentioned in all 4 of the Gospels. I was in almost all 5. I don't know what to say. But in the Gospel of John, when Jesus says, "What do you have?" People were there, they were hungry, there were at least 5,000, if not more. And he was told, Jesus was told, we only have 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Jesus told them to have the people sit down in groups. He prayed over the food, and they started to feed the multitude. Those 5 loaves and 2 fishes, after everybody ate, the remnants that were left filled 12 baskets. Now, I don't know how big the baskets were. I saw Nancy working on one earlier this morning. But I think the basket might have been bigger than that one. I bet I had to say it, Nancy. A boy. Andrew said, "I have a boy here that has 5 loaves and 2 fishes, but it's so little." You'd be surprised what God can do if you're willing to do it. Paul's nephew heard about a conspiracy to kill Paul. These men that were going to do it had vowed that they were not going to eat until they accomplished their purpose of killing Paul. Paul was in prison. The nephew heard of it, and he went to Paul. Paul went and took the nephew to the centurion, or whoever was guarding the prison. The little boy told what he heard, and Paul's life was spared. Unnamed. His sister's son. Unnamed. Who knows if that word of kindness, that deed of love, the hug around the shoulders, what they could do. There's 2 thoughts that I wanted to use to conclude my message this morning. One of the things I always loved to do when I was a kid, we used to live alongside within walking distance of the High River. And on pretty spring days when the river was flowing smoothly, I used to love to go down and get little pebbles and throw in the river and watch the ripples go out. And I remember that so often because we drop a pebble, a kind deed, a kind word, an act of love into the pond of life. And ripples go out. How far that goes, God knows. And you don't know how far that good things we do will go. Then the other thought that I had, and I asked the people who knew it, but how many of you remember the old time hymn? And I found it on the internet, called "Right in the Corner Where You Are." It was sung by Ella Fitzgerald. I don't know who wrote it. Nancy indicated the fact that it was a chorus, and people used to just sing the chorus because the words were hard. Right in the corner, there's 3 verses that when I read the verses this past week, I didn't recognize them. And I want you to go home. And wherever you are, whatever you do, make it right. Right in the corner where you are. And let's see what God can do. We're going to be singing our invitation hymn. If there's any here that needs to make a decision for Christ, we invite you to come. And we invite you to come and give your life to Christ. Shall we stand as we sing?